No, it's not like Rogan, but like yes, it is a podcast. Yeah.
Keith, they'll tell you that not having sex is the best form of birth control, to which I disagree. Unequivocally, the best form of birth control is getting barbed wire tattooed around your arm. And not the tasteful barbed wire tattoos, I'm talking about the ones that come on arms with permanent farmer's tans, on bodies with eyes that you're not sure what color they are because they're always taking cover behind tactical Oakleys. More than just an international sign of road rage, this type of barbed wire tattoo might be a stronger deterrent than the MAGA hat. It's something that heightens the senses quicker than smelling salts. I should know. I knew someone with that very type of tattoo. I first considered that he got it done in good ironic taste. But then he started to use the word badass to describe anything that society has paired with testosterone. Guns, knives, cars, shitty edits of eagles with the American flag in the background. His name was Keith, the man with the tattoo. I sold him Adderall for a couple of weeks, and I think he thought that meant something. Keith may have quite literally been the exact opposite of anyone who I'd ever want to associate with. He looked like the older, sober Vince Neil, in the sense that maybe he was athletic in his youth, but his metabolism had since slowed down, and a diet of consistent saturated fats had caught up to him. He dressed with the discipline only found in Catholic schools or cartoon characters. There was a remarkable repetition to his wardrobe, something there was a remarkable repetition to his wardrobe, strictly wearing a certain crinkled khaki short and white tank top where the only sort of variation came from the generic slogans on it. I just want to fish and lead me to the grill. I'll handle it from here were his personal favorites. We had a class on geodes together where we would sit next to each other 3 times a week for 55 minutes at a time. I thought this was the extent of our relationship, but that just wasn't the case. He always made it a point to approach me whenever he saw me. A hello would have been suffice, but he felt the need to make his presence known by punching me in the arm. And he was always sweaty, which I suppose explains the tank tops, and not that this actually helped his image at all of being a walking vat of septic fluid. Keith was disgusting, perpetually congested, always trying to summon mucus from the back of his throat. I passed him my paper once to review a homework answer, and he returned it damp with what looked like hot Cheeto dusted fingerprints in the corner. One too many times he'd say that I had to hear a certain song, so he'd offer his headphones, ones that might as well have been coated in Maker's Mark earwax. Luckily, it was always and only something by Machine Gun Kelly, so I just tell him that I'd heard it already. Keith wore one-strap backpacks, the padded JanSport branded kind, something that I think should only be used by those initiated with JavaScript or C++, but to each their own. And the one-strap backpack, it actually wasn't that big of an issue, but the cloud of entitlement that came with it was. Back pain, John, he'd chirp. That's where you're going to get back pain and Advil in bulk. But not me. This is called a sash pack. Look into it. This got annoying, but from what was the consistent chafing that he received from the strap on the exposed parts of skin that came with his dedicated wear of tank tops, I was able to tolerate it. Where Keith really tested me was when he'd talk in class. Though he had many flaws, by and large, his worst was that he had no control over his volume, as if he was always having to talk over the never-ending rumble that comes with a healthy V8 engine. If Keith was preaching the word of God or regurgitating remarkably generic content you find in the darker corners of LinkedIn, this wouldn't be a problem, but this was far from the case. If his worst flaw was that he was loud, his second was that he had no filter. If there was one, it was a wet piece of tissue paper to whatever a Brit is made of. His situational awareness was also poor. I was on the silent floor of the library one time when he felt the need to all but yell that he was horny. I turned around to the students, giving both a look that said, "I'm sorry and please help me," but they just chuckled and went back to writing. "Dude, this is the library," I whispered at him. "And how's that supposed to help?" he chirped back. No, he didn't chirp back. He went like this. And he was just like, "And how's that supposed to help?" And it was kind of in like disgust, but he was literally confused. "How's that supposed to help?" It was odd. It was a guarantee that he would talk loudly wherever he was. The question was whether or not he'd say something disgusting at high volumes. That's what would keep me on edge in class. That's what would keep me at the ready. There was one time in particular where our professor, he was detailing the iron oxides that play a part in the coloring of specific geodes, when Keith had the audacity to tell me that he had finally watched The Office. He added, "My favorite character is the nerd, Dwight Schrute." Had our class been in an auditorium, I would have pulled my hoodie over my head and sunk beneath my chair, but the classes at U of E are better put as pods. There were only 9 of us in the room. Everyone heard that, and everyone laughed. I stopped selling to him after this, thinking that maybe without me supplying his attention span, he'd quit paying it to me. Maybe now I could read up in peace without having to brace for a blow to the arm or for someone to loudly tell me when they're feeling sexually urgent. Instead, things only became more frequent. What was a weekly basis became daily. What were jabs to the arm became hooks. What were revelations about The Office became revelations about Parks and Rec. I'd panic, wanting to yell at him to say, "Keith, shut the fuck up." But that's not me. Sometimes I'd skiff off to the bathroom to splash water in my face and tell myself that didn't just happen. But his random interjecting, out loud thoughts would sometimes happen right after I'd used the bathroom, so I'd be forced to parry them away with comments like, "Let's talk about this later," or "Oh, really?" My defense was nothing more than a mild-mannered ointment to a highly volatile and reactionary rash. Our professor didn't help, Mr. Lewis. I thought after a few outbreaks, law would be laid down, but there was anything but that from them, daring to only say, "Keith, come on." Where was I? Geodes. Anyway, they'd go on. Each failed disciplinary action, I'd bite my cheek. I'd crinkle my... Each failed disciplinary attempt, I'd bite my cheek, I'd crinkle my paper and whisper, "Tenure," under my breath. People would tell me to switch seats, and I would tell them that I had tried. People would tell me to ignore him, and I would tell them that I had tried. Maybe he means well is how I end these conversations, then change the subject to something else. I thought Keith might... honestly, I thought he actually maybe meant well, maybe just a little awkward, until I caught him peeking at my answers during the multiple choice portion of our midterm exam. Had he made 7 fewer remarks about his one-strap backpack, I may have helped him pass, but no, this is what he got. It didn't take long for him to notice that I wouldn't budge, so he began to poke me in the ribs with his pencil over and over again, trying to get me to break form to give him a window of opportunity to see how many times I had answered the letter D. It didn't help that Mr. Lewis was in another universe watching something on his desktop with headphones, leaving us with one simple piece of instruction: don't talk. I brought my right knee up into my chair, creating a shield, hoping that the tissue on my thigh would discourage Keith's efforts. It did, in some way, but it just had him to resort to calling upon a stubborn clod of mucus from the back of his throat, fishing for a stingy loogie with what sounded like unforeseen grip strength. In my opinion, the most disgusting part about it was that he didn't care that he was making anyone else in the room nauseous. The sick fuck was after my answers, and that was it. What's that quote from The Dark Knight? "Some people just want to watch the world burn." That applied here. Why I was contorting myself, keeping my innards from coming up for a class that didn't even matter, I wasn't sure. I had most of the tests done and had rushed myself to the conclusion that a 70% would be fine. I filled in the spaces randomly for the last bit. I'd had enough of Keith for this portion. After turning in my exam, I went to refuel with an everything bagel at the trolley in the quad, and double toast with butter is how I take them. The writing section wasn't until the next afternoon, so I take the rest of the day to mosey through notes, being thankful that this class was mainly dependent on participation before cramming later that evening, or so I figured. I did away with the wax paper and laid into the most consistent treat that I knew when I realized I left my phone in the classroom. This meant no snapshot story of the bagel, but still a plus for finishing early. I'd meander back with more than enough time to get my phone and maybe brown-nose Mr. Lewis while I was at it. My hands buttered, I opened the door with my hips. "And here he is, Mr. Lewis, coming back to the scene of the crime they always do." "Is this true, John?" Mr. Lewis asked in a very Mr. Lewis way. "Were you cheating off Keith?" "What?" I said. This was shocking and odd turn of events. Mr. Lewis was giving the time of day to the man who interrupts class to essentially let them know that he has a Netflix account. Oh my gosh, he's answering with a question. Maybe he should just go to the dean's office now, huh, Mr. Lou? Keith said with a smirk. Mr. Lewis brought his palm to his face. John, I don't need this right now. As he exhaled, Keith slipped me a middle finger. Go to the dean's office. You're flunked or an academic suspension. I'll let them handle it. Mr. Lewis, Nope. Up to the dean now. The dean was less Mr. Lewis-ish, making things easier to navigate. My case was the pencil jab marks at the ribs and the testament of his constant disruptions. Our answers were far too different to prove any sort of cheating as well, so while I passed the class, Keith did throw in the Adderall piece and I wasn't able to clean up the drug dealing, even though my defense was stout, labeling it as a facilitation of attention retention. They didn't buy it, ultimately landing me a quick stint on academic suspension. But after that, I was back in class learning about upper-level geodes with an empty seat next to me.